In 1916, Russia unleashed hell. Brusilov's thunderclap, Russia's last victory before collapse. One general, one offensive, millions of soldiers. What happened next would shake an empire to its core and change everything. Subscribe for untold stories from history's darkest moments. In the summer of 1916, the Eastern Front lay locked in stalemate. The Russian army had endured 2 years of catastrophic losses, retreating across vast territories. While generals squabbled over strategy and supply lines withered, the Central Powers believed they had broken Russian capacity to wage offensive war. They were catastrophically wrong. On the 4th of June 1916, General Alexei Brusilov unleashed something the Austro-Hungarian Empire had not anticipated, a perfectly coordinated surprise assault across multiple sectors in Galicia and Bukovina. What followed would become the most devastating blow Russia delivered in the entire war, shattering the Austro-Hungarian army and capturing hundreds of thousands of prisoners. Within days, the initial assault had torn open massive gaps in enemy lines. By the 16th of June, German reinforcements arrived to stabilize the front. Yet the Russians pressed forward through July and August, refusing to yield their advantage. Officers in the field reported moments of triumph that seemed impossible just weeks before. Soldiers advanced across terrain they had lost, reclaiming ground soaked in their comrades' blood. Yet this greatest of Russian victories carried within it the seeds of ultimate catastrophe. The offensive demanded everything the empire possessed: men, ammunition, resources, and morale. It would extract a price so terrible that when the advance finally stalled, the Russian army would never truly recover. Victory had awakened something far more dangerous than any foreign enemy, the possibility of revolution itself. The Russian Empire in 1915 was a nation at war with itself long before it faced the Central Powers. While millions of soldiers bled across the Eastern Front, the machinery of state ground ever slower, its gears worn by incompetence, corruption, and the sheer logistical impossibility of sustaining modern warfare. The army had suffered catastrophic losses, nearly 2 million casualties in the first year alone. Yet the Tsar's government seemed incapable of learning from the disasters that accumulated like snow across the frozen landscape. It was into this fractured world that General Alexei Brusilov emerged as something approaching a voice of reason among the Russian high command. Unlike many of his peers, Brusilov was not a nobleman elevated through court connections or imperial favor. He was a professional soldier, a career officer who had built his reputation through careful study, methodical planning, and an almost obsessive attention to detail. Born into the minor gentry, he had served with distinction in the Russo-Japanese War, where he had observed firsthand how traditional cavalry tactics crumbled before machine gun fire and entrenchments. That painful education would shape everything he attempted to accomplish in the Great War. By early 1916, Brusilov commanded the Southwest Front, which stretched across southern Russia and extended into Galicia and Bukovina. The terrain under his command was brutally diverse. Rolling hills gave way to river valleys, forests alternated with open plains, and the earth itself seemed to shift between mud and dust depending on the season. This was not the straightforward battlefield of Western European warfare. This was a frontier of empires, a region that had changed hands repeatedly throughout history, and it demanded commanders who understood not merely tactics, but the very land upon which those tactics would be executed. The Russian army that Brusilov inherited was in a state of profound demoralization. After the catastrophic retreat of 1915, when General Evert's armies had been pushed back across hundreds of kilometers, confidence in the upper echelons of command had evaporated like morning mist. Soldiers questioned whether their officers possessed any genuine tactical understanding or merely sent them forward in waves to die against entrenched positions. Officers, meanwhile, struggled with fundamental shortages of ammunition, artillery, and even basic supplies. A Russian soldier in 1915 was as likely to lack boots as to possess them. Rifles were shared among units, with men detailed to pick up weapons from fallen comrades. The situation was not merely dire, it was becoming untenable. Yet Brusilov possessed a quality rare among Russian commanders. He listened. He studied the German and Austro-Hungarian defensive systems not as an abstract exercise but as a puzzle to be solved. He examined the reports from his subordinates not with the dismissive arrogance of aristocratic generals, but with the careful attention of a man who understood that lives depended upon his comprehension. And what he discovered was both encouraging and troubling. The Central Powers had indeed established strong defensive positions, but they had also overextended themselves. The Austro-Hungarian forces in particular were thinly spread across their sector of the front. They were exhausted from years of warfare, depleted by the demands of fighting Italy in the south, while simultaneously holding the line against Russia. Here Brusilov recognized was an opportunity. but only if it could be seized with precision and overwhelming force. In the winter of 1915 and into the early months of 1916, Brusilov began to formulate a plan that departed radically from the conventional Russian approach to offensive warfare. Rather than concentrating all available forces at a single point and hurling them against the enemy in what amounted to a frontal assault, he conceived of a strategy that emphasized deception, preparation, and the simultaneous application of pressure across multiple fronts. He would not telegraph his intentions through obvious concentrations of troops. Instead, he would prepare several different sectors for attack, keeping the enemy uncertain about where the main blow would fall. Then, when the moment came, he would strike not with one hammer blow but with several, each designed to penetrate the enemy lines at different points and create multiple crises that the Central Powers would struggle to contain. This approach required something that the Russian army had previously lacked in abundance: preparation and coordination. Brusilov demanded that his officers conduct reconnaissance with a rigor that had been absent from previous campaigns. He insisted upon detailed maps, upon careful study of enemy positions, upon understanding not merely where the enemy stood, but why they had chosen those positions. He implemented training programs designed to prepare infantry for the specific task of assault. He coordinated with his artillery commanders to develop fire plans that would break the enemy's defensive systems rather than merely batter them. And crucially, he began accumulating supplies, ammunition in particular, with a determination born of understanding that his entire strategy depended upon having sufficient ordnance to support the assault. The political context surrounding Brusilov's preparations was equally significant, though often overlooked in purely military histories. In 1915, Russia's political situation had deteriorated precipitously. The Tsar, Nicholas II, had taken personal command of the armies in September of that year, removing himself from Petrograd and thereby losing direct control over the civilian government. His absence created a vacuum that was filled by the Tsarina Alexandra, who was influenced by the mystical charlatan Grigory Rasputin. The government became increasingly dysfunctional, with ministers appointed and dismissed seemingly at random, with little regard for competence or experience. It was a government in crisis, and it desperately needed a military success to restore its credibility and buy time before internal collapse became inevitable. Brusilov understood this political reality, though he was careful never to explicitly acknowledge it in his official communications. A general who involved himself in politics was a dangerous creature, likely to be eliminated by rivals. Yet he also understood that his opportunity was time-limited. If the Russian government collapsed, if the army's morale finally shattered completely, then no amount of tactical brilliance would matter. He had a window of opportunity, and it was beginning to close. The pressure from the Tsar's government for a major offensive was mounting, as was the pressure from the French and British, who desperately needed Russia to attack in the east to relieve pressure on their own forces engaged in the grinding horror of the Western Front. By the spring of 1916, as the snow began to melt and the mud began to dry, Brusilov's preparations neared completion. He had accumulated reserves of ammunition that were, by Russian standards, almost luxurious in their abundance. He had trained his assault troops in new techniques, emphasizing the importance of small unit tactics and the coordination between infantry and artillery. He had positioned his forces so that an attack could be launched simultaneously across multiple fronts, from the Pripyat marshes in the north to the Bukovina region in the south. He had even managed to establish a rough coordination with the other Russian fronts, though the jealousy and political maneuvering that characterized the Russian High Command made such cooperation difficult and incomplete. The Austro-Hungarian forces opposing him, meanwhile, were approaching a state of crisis without fully realizing it. They had held their lines through the previous winter, but at enormous cost. Their supply lines were stretched thin, their manpower was becoming increasingly depleted, with draft calls becoming more and more desperate as the war consumed the youth of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. They had received reports of Russian preparations, but they could not be certain where the main attack would come. Was it in Galicia? Was it in Bukovina? Was it further north? The uncertainty itself became a form of pressure, forcing them to spread their limited reserves across an impossibly broad front. As April turned to May and May turned toward June, the final preparations accelerated. Brusilov issued orders that would have seemed almost casual to a civilian observer, but which represented the culmination of months of careful planning. Artillery pieces were moved into position, often under cover of darkness to avoid detection. Infantry units were briefed on their objectives, supply lines were tested and refined. And throughout the Southwest Front, soldiers, many of them conscripts who had been in the army for less than a year, men who had never seen combat, were told that they would soon be attacking. Some were frightened, some were eager, most were simply resigned to whatever fate awaited them. The weather in early June of 1916 was turning toward summer. though the ground remained soft in places from the spring thaw. The nights were brief, the days long. In the trenches and dugouts along the front, men checked their rifles for the 100th time, cleaned their equipment, wrote letters home that many suspected they would never receive. Officers inspected their units, looking for signs of weakness or cowardice that might undermine the coming assault. Scouts probed forward, gathering intelligence about enemy positions, mapping out the wire and the trenches and the machine gun nests that would have to be overcome. Brusilov himself was calm in these final days, or at least appeared to be. Those who encountered him reported that he seemed almost serene, moving among his staff with quiet confidence, reviewing plans one final time, making small adjustments that seemed to exist at the intersection of military science and intuition. He had done everything he could do. The outcome was now in the hands of fortune, of the soldiers who would have to cross no man's land, of the artillery gunners who would have to time their barrages with precision, of the junior officers who would have to lead their men forward into machine gun fire and artillery shells. The intelligence that Brusilov's forces possessed about the enemy was reasonably accurate, though incomplete. They knew that the Austro-Hungarian lines were held by troops who were exhausted and depleted. They knew that the German forces opposing them were more formidable but also more thinly spread than in the north. They knew that the enemy had concentrated significant forces in certain sectors while leaving others more lightly defended. What they could not know with certainty was how the enemy would respond once the attack began, whether reinforcements would arrive quickly, whether the initial penetrations could be widened into a genuine breakthrough. As the 4th of June approached, Brusilov made his final decision. The offensive would begin the next morning. The artillery would open fire at dawn, and the infantry would assault immediately afterward. It was a moment that had been building for months, that had been prepared for with a rigor that was almost unprecedented in Russian military history. Everything now depended upon execution, upon whether the carefully laid plans would survive contact with the enemy, upon whether the Russian soldier, so often written off as cannon fodder by observers both foreign and domestic, would prove capable of achieving what his general believed was possible. The night of the 3rd of June was quiet across the southwest front. In the trenches, men tried to sleep but mostly could not. Officers made final checks of their equipment. Runners moved between command posts, carrying the last of the orders that would set the offensive in motion. Somewhere in the darkness, a horse whinnied. Somewhere else, a soldier coughed. The vast machinery of war was coiled and ready to spring, and in the morning, when the sun rose over the eastern front, it would unleash forces that would shake the entire structure of the Great War and send shockwaves rippling across the empire that Tsar Nicholas II ruled from his headquarters far to the rear. The spring of 1916 arrived cold and uncertain across the eastern front. After the devastating retreats of the previous year, the Russian army stood at a crossroads. General Alexei Brusilov, commanding the southwest front with methodical precision, believed the stalemate could be broken not through desperate cavalry charges or frontal assaults against prepared positions, but through careful preparation, deception, and concentrated force at carefully selected points. While other Russian commanders debated strategy in distant headquarters, Brusilov and his staff conducted a revolution in offensive warfare that would shake the Austro-Hungarian lines to their foundations. The decision to launch the offensive emerged from a complex web of political and military pressures. The French and British, locked in the grinding carnage at Verdun since February, pleaded with their Russian allies to relieve pressure on the Western Front by attacking in the east. The Austro-Hungarian army, meanwhile, had committed significant forces to the south, attempting to crush the Serbian resistance and secure their borders. Brusilov recognized in this moment of distraction an unprecedented opportunity. Unlike the hasty, poorly coordinated offensives of previous years, this attack would be methodical, prepared, and devastating. Brusilov's genius lay not in revolutionary tactics, but in meticulous execution of sound principles. He rejected the conventional wisdom that dominated Russian military thought. Instead of concentrating forces at a single point, he organized multiple simultaneous attacks along a broad front stretching from the Pripyat marshes in the north to Bukovina in the south. This dispersion of effort confused the enemy about where the main assault would fall. More importantly, it prevented the Austro-Hungarians from concentrating reserves to meet the attack at any single location. Each sector commander received detailed instructions for preliminary bombardment, reconnaissance, and coordination with neighboring units. For the first time in the Russian army's experience during this war, there existed a genuine operational plan rather than a collection of desperate hopes. The preliminary bombardment began on the 22nd of May, 1916. Russian artillery, having accumulated reserves of ammunition through careful management and increased production from domestic factories, unleashed a devastating barrage against Austro-Hungarian positions. The bombardment lasted for days, systematically destroying wire obstacles, dugouts, and communication trenches. Unlike the Western Front, where bombardments often lasted for weeks and telegraphed intentions to the enemy, Brusilov kept the bombardment relatively brief. The element of surprise remained crucial. Officers under his command understood that artillery preparation served a specific tactical purpose: to damage enemy defenses enough to allow infantry to break through, not to obliterate the entire landscape. Reconnaissance patrols operated with unprecedented sophistication. Brusilov insisted on detailed intelligence about enemy positions, strength, and morale. Officers descended into no man's land to examine wire obstacles, map trenches, and identify weak points in the Austro-Hungarian defenses. This information filtered back to headquarters, where intelligence officers compiled detailed maps and reports. Junior officers received briefings on what they would face. Soldiers understood their objectives. The fog of war, while never entirely lifted, had been substantially diminished through systematic preparation. The soldiers themselves represented a cross-section of the Russian Empire. Factory workers from Moscow and St. Petersburg stood alongside peasants from Ukraine and Siberia. Cossacks from the Don region trained with infantrymen from the Baltic provinces. Ethnic Russians, Ukrainians, Poles, Armenians, and dozens of other nationalities prepared for the coming assault. Many had survived the previous years of catastrophic losses. They possessed an institutional memory of failure, of commanders' mistakes, of inadequate supplies and ammunition shortages. Yet, Brusilov's meticulous preparation inspired something rare in the Russian army by 1916. Cautious optimism. The soldiers could see the ammunition dumps, the carefully positioned artillery, the detailed orders. Perhaps they dared to hope this offensive might succeed where others had failed. The attack commenced on the 4th of June, 1916. The artillery barrage intensified into a thunderous crescendo. Russian guns, positioned in carefully calculated arrays, poured fire onto Austro-Hungarian positions. Infantry rose from their trenches and advanced across no man's land. The preliminary bombardment had done its work. Wire obstacles, while not entirely destroyed, had been sufficiently damaged that soldiers could pass through. Austro-Hungarian defenses, caught off guard by the weight and coordination of the assault, began to crumble. The breakthrough came with stunning rapidity in some sectors. The Austro-Hungarian army, stretched thin across vast distances and weakened by the commitment of forces elsewhere, could not withstand the coordinated onslaught. In some areas, defenders broke and fled. Prisoners streamed backward by the thousands. Russian units advanced kilometers in a single day, distances that would have seemed impossible after years of trench warfare. By the 8th of June 1916, merely 4 days into the offensive, the scale of the breakthrough became apparent to commanders on both sides. The Austro-Hungarian lines had been shattered in multiple locations. General Konrad von Hötzendorf, commanding Austro-Hungarian forces, faced a catastrophe. His armies had been caught unprepared for an offensive of such magnitude and coordination. Messages arrived at headquarters reporting entire regiments surrounded, divisional commanders captured, and artillery pieces abandoned in the confusion of retreat. The reserves available to him proved insufficient to contain the breakthrough. By mid-June, the situation had deteriorated to the point where German intervention became necessary. The Central Powers could not afford the collapse of their Austro-Hungarian ally. Reinforcements began moving from the Western Front and other sectors, including elite German units accustomed to stopping even the most determined offensives. The human cost of these initial successes, however, mounted with terrible swiftness. While the breakthrough achieved tactical surprise and initial success, the fighting remained grinding and brutal. Infantry assaults, even against weakened defenses, meant casualties. Machine gun fire, though less concentrated than in previous battles due to the destruction of prepared positions, still claimed thousands of soldiers. Artillery barrages from both sides churned the landscape into mud and corpses. Medical services, though better organized than in previous Russian offensives, still struggled to cope with the volume of wounded. Field hospitals overflowed with men suffering from shrapnel wounds, gas attacks, and the infections that inevitably followed battlefield trauma. Contemporary accounts from participants reveal the intensity of the fighting. A junior officer with the Russian Third Army, writing in his diary on the 7th of June, described the assault. "We advanced through the broken wire and smoke toward the enemy trenches. The Austro-Hungarians were confused, many surrendering without resistance. But machine guns from positions we had not detected opened fire on the left flank. Men fell screaming. We kept advancing because retreat meant death and because we had been ordered to take the position. By afternoon we held the enemy trench, but of the 200 men in my company, perhaps 100 remained able to fight." The offensive's success created unprecedented numbers of prisoners. Russian units, advancing rapidly, captured vast quantities of Austro-Hungarian soldiers. Conservative estimates place the number of prisoners taken in the first weeks of the offensive at over 200,000. Some sources suggest the figure exceeded 300,000 by mid-June. These prisoners represented both a logistical challenge and a propaganda victory. The Russian army, which had experienced humiliation through years of retreat and massive captures of its own soldiers, now reversed the equation. Photographs of long columns of Austro-Hungarian prisoners guarded by Russian infantry circulated through newspapers. The psychological impact on Russian society, devastated by years of defeats, proved significant. Yet the very success of the initial breakthrough created new problems. Russian supply lines, already strained, struggled to keep pace with advancing armies. Ammunition consumption exceeded expectations. Soldiers, advancing rapidly across territory that had been devastated by years of warfare, found few supplies captured from the enemy. Horses, essential for moving artillery and supplies in 1916, became exhausted. The infrastructure of the Russian army, never robust, began to show serious strain. Brusilov found himself in the paradoxical position of achieving tactical success while facing logistical crisis. The arrival of German reinforcements in mid-June, particularly around the 16th of June 1916, stabilized the Austro-Hungarian lines. The Germans, masters of defensive warfare and tactical counterattacks, deployed elite units to critical sectors. These German forces, moving with precision and coordinated firepower, halted Russian advances that had seemed unstoppable days earlier. The dynamic of the campaign shifted. No longer could Russian armies advance with relative ease. Instead, they faced determined resistance from well-organized German units supported by adequate artillery and supplies. The tactical situation in late June and early July illustrated the complexity of modern warfare. The Russian breakthrough, while genuine, had not achieved the decisive victory that might have ended the war on the Eastern Front. The Germans and Austro-Hungarians, despite their losses, retained the ability to organize defense and counterattack. The front, rather than collapsing, simply shifted backward. Russian armies held more territory, but at tremendous cost. Casualty figures mounted with each passing day. Estimates place Russian casualties during the first month of the offensive at between 300,000 and 500,000 men killed, wounded, or captured. The offensive continued through July and August, though with diminishing intensity and success. Brusilov, recognizing the limits of what his armies could achieve against German resistance, attempted to maintain momentum by shifting the point of attack and organizing supporting offensives on other sectors of the front. The Northern Front and the Western Front launched attacks designed to relieve pressure on the Southwest Front and exploit German weaknesses elsewhere. Some success attended these efforts, but none achieved the breakthrough that might have transformed the Eastern Front. By August, the Brusilov Offensive had effectively ended as a major operation. Though fighting continued, the front had stabilized at new positions further west than where it had begun. Russian armies held significantly more territory than in June, but at a cost that strained the resources of the Russian Empire. Casualty estimates for the entire offensive, from June 4 through August 10, 1916, suggest Russian losses between 500,000 and 1 million men killed, wounded, or captured. Austro-Hungarian casualties, though difficult to calculate precisely due to the chaos of the retreat and the large numbers of prisoners taken, exceeded Russian losses by some measures, with estimates ranging from 750,000 to over 1 million men. The political implications of these staggering casualty figures rippled through the Russian Empire. While initial news of the breakthrough created jubilation in St. Petersburg and Moscow, the mounting casualty lists soon sobered public opinion. Families received notifications that sons, fathers, and brothers had been killed or wounded. The military hospitals that had been filled with wounded from previous disasters now overflowed again. The burden on the medical system, already stretched by 3 years of warfare, became impossible to bear. Surgeons and nurses worked without rest, attempting to treat wounds that often resulted in amputation or death from infection. At the same time, the offensive demonstrated something important about the Russian army's capacity for improvement. The organization, planning, and execution of the Brusilov Offensive represented a genuine advance in Russian military competence. Brusilov and his staff had created and executed an operational plan of sophistication and scope. Junior officers and non-commissioned officers had demonstrated the ability to handle complex maneuvers and coordinate with neighboring units. The soldiers had shown courage and determination in the face of well-prepared defenses. If the war had ended in 1916, or if the offensive had achieved more decisive results, the Brusilov Offensive might have been remembered as evidence of the Russian army's capacity for regeneration and improvement. Instead, the offensive represented the last great operational success of the Russian army in the First World War. The casualties, while inflicted on the enemy as well, exhausted the human resources available to the Russian Empire. The strain on the economy, the disruption of civilian life to support the war effort, and the mounting losses created pressures that would contribute to the revolutionary upheavals that would consume Russia in the years immediately following. The soldiers, increasingly aware that their sacrifices achieved no lasting strategic advantage, grew skeptical of commanders and government alike. The home front, burdened by the demands of war and experiencing shortages of food and fuel, grew restless and angry. The summer of 1916 thus represented a moment of both triumph and tragedy. The Brusilov Offensive proved that the Russian army could organize and execute complex operations with skill and determination. It demonstrated that the Central Powers remained vulnerable and that the Eastern Front, while seemingly stable, contained potential for dramatic shifts. Yet it also demonstrated the ultimate futility of operational success when the underlying strategic situation remained unchanged and the human and material resources of the combatants became exhausted. The offensive's success could not be translated into strategic victory because the fundamental problems that had plagued the Russian war effort, supply shortages, political chaos, and the inability to coordinate with allies, remained unresolved. As August arrived and the Brusilov offensive wound down, Russian commanders faced the reality that despite the breakthrough, despite the hundreds of thousands of prisoners captured, despite the territorial gains, the war remained far from won. The Central Powers, though battered, had not collapsed. The German army, though stretched, had not been broken. The future held only the promise of continued grinding warfare, with casualty lists growing longer and the strain on Russian society becoming ever more intense. The dawn of June 4, 1916, broke grey and uncertain across the Eastern Front. In the trenches and dugouts of Galicia and Bukovina, Russian soldiers gripped their rifles with trembling hands. Aware that something momentous was about to unfold, General Alexei Brusilov had spent months planning what would become the most ambitious Russian offensive of the entire war. A coordinated assault that would stretch across 400 miles of front, targeting the weakened Austro-Hungarian forces with a precision and scale that had eluded Russian commanders for nearly 2 years of catastrophic failure. The operational plan itself represented a radical departure from Russian military tradition. Rather than concentrating forces at a single point of breakthrough, Brusilov had convinced the High Command to authorize multiple simultaneous attacks across the entire front. This strategy, born from careful analysis of trench warfare's evolution and the specific weaknesses he had identified in Austro-Hungarian dispositions, would demand unprecedented coordination and logistical sophistication. The Russian army, so often criticized for its rigid hierarchies and poor communication, would now be asked to execute a masterpiece of tactical flexibility. When the preliminary artillery barrage commenced in the pre-dawn darkness, the earth itself seemed to convulse. The Russians had assembled an artillery concentration that, while still inferior to German standards, represented the most formidable accumulation of guns the Eastern Front had yet witnessed. For days, the bombardment continued with relentless intensity. Austro-Hungarian trenches collapsed under the weight of explosive metal. Wire entanglements that had seemed impenetrable were torn to shreds. The psychological effect upon the defenders was devastating. Men who had endured 2 years of warfare found themselves facing an assault of such magnitude that many questioned whether survival was even possible. The initial Russian waves, launched on June 4th and continuing through June 8th, encountered far less resistance than anyone had anticipated. The Austro-Hungarian forces, weakened by the relentless bombardment and depleted by previous years of grinding attrition, began to crumble. In some sectors, entire regiments surrendered wholesale rather than face the advancing Russian infantry. The breakthrough, when it came, was not the desperate, bloody affair that characterized so much of Great War combat. Instead, it resembled something closer to a rout. Russian soldiers poured through gaps in the enemy lines, advancing with a speed that suggested the Austro-Hungarian army might be on the verge of complete collapse. The casualty figures from those first days of the offensive were staggering. The Austro-Hungarian forces, facing the concentrated fury of Russian artillery and the disciplined assault of Russian infantrymen, suffered losses estimated between 750,000 and over 1 million men, including those captured, killed, wounded, and those who deserted in the face of overwhelming force. The scale of these losses was so catastrophic that some historians have suggested the Austro-Hungarian army never truly recovered. The empire's military capacity, already stretched thin across multiple fronts and weakened by years of industrial attrition, had sustained a blow from which it would struggle to recover for the remainder of the war. Yet even as Brusilov's offensive achieved its initial objectives with almost startling success, the seeds of ultimate failure were already germinating. The very success of the breakthrough created new problems. Russian supply lines, never adequate even in defensive positions, became stretched to breaking point as armies advanced deeper into captured territory. The logistics of moving ammunition, food, and reinforcements across hundreds of miles of devastated landscape through regions where infrastructure had been systematically destroyed proved overwhelmingly difficult. Officers in the field began reporting shortages of ammunition and supplies with increasing frequency and desperation. Furthermore, the initial success placed Brusilov in a complex political position. His plan had depended upon coordinated action from other Russian armies along the front, yet these supporting offensives failed to materialize with the necessary force and timing. The Russian High Command, riven by factional disputes and hampered by the personal animosities between senior commanders, proved unable to provide the coordinated pressure that might have transformed a major tactical victory into a strategic breakthrough. Where Brusilov advanced and smashed the Austro-Hungarian lines, other Russian commanders either attacked hesitantly or not at all, allowing German reserves to concentrate against the breakthrough sector. The German response came swiftly and with characteristic efficiency. By June 16th, German-led counterattacks had begun to stabilize the front, though they could not eliminate the gains Brusilov had achieved. The German High Command, recognizing the danger posed by the successful Russian offensive, rushed reinforcements from other sectors. The decision to reinforce the Eastern Front came at significant cost to German operations elsewhere, particularly in France, where the Somme offensive was consuming German reserves at an alarming rate. Historians have long debated the degree to which the Brusilov offensive influenced German strategic decisions, but contemporaneous German records indicate that the threat of complete collapse in the East was taken with utmost seriousness. The human cost of the offensive's continuation became increasingly apparent as July progressed into August. Russian soldiers, initially buoyed by the success of the breakthrough, found themselves engaged in increasingly desperate fighting against German reinforcements that were arriving with greater frequency. The front, which had moved dramatically eastward in the first weeks of June, began to stabilize as German tactical skill and superior artillery began to exert their influence. The momentum of the Russian advance, so dramatic in early June, slowed to a crawl by late July. Contemporary accounts from the Russian trenches reveal the mounting desperation and exhaustion. Officers reported that men were becoming increasingly reluctant to press attacks in the face of German artillery concentrations. Desertion rates, which had been relatively low during the initial breakthrough, began to climb as soldiers recognized that the offensive was no longer yielding dramatic territorial gains, but instead settling into the kind of grinding, attritional warfare that had already consumed so many of their comrades. Soldiers' letters, when they reached the rear, spoke of exhaustion, hunger, and a growing sense of hopelessness. One particularly revealing document comes from a junior officer who participated in the offensive. Writing to his sister in July, he captured the deteriorating morale with devastating honesty. The first days of the offensive were glorious beyond measure. We were advancing, the enemy was retreating, and it seemed that at last Russia would achieve the victory that has eluded us for so long. But now, week after week, we attack German positions and gain nothing but more graves. The men are exhausted. The supply situation is becoming desperate. I fear we are approaching the point where even the most disciplined soldiers will refuse to continue. The question of supply, which had plagued Russian operations throughout the war, became absolutely critical to the offensive's sustainability. The Russian army, despite Brusilov's careful planning, lacked the logistical infrastructure necessary to sustain an operation of such magnitude. The railway network in Western Russia, inadequate even before the war, had been further damaged by years of conflict. Horses, upon which the entire logistical system depended, were dying in vast numbers from exhaustion and disease. By late July, some Russian divisions were receiving ammunition allocations so minimal that they could mount only limited operations. The political consequences of the offensive's stalling became increasingly apparent as the summer of 1916 progressed. The Tsar, initially pleased by Brusilov's success, began to question whether the massive casualties were justified by the territorial gains. The Russian public, which had initially celebrated the news of the breakthrough, grew increasingly disillusioned as casualty lists mounted and the promised decisive victory failed to materialize. The offensive, which had been intended to restore Russian prestige and demonstrate the army's capacity for modern warfare, instead became another symbol of the empire's inability to convert tactical success into strategic advantage. Behind the lines, the political situation in Russia was deteriorating rapidly. The massive casualties of the Brusilov offensive, combined with the continuing failure to achieve a decisive breakthrough, deepened the rifts between the Tsar and significant portions of the Russian elite. The Empress, increasingly isolated in her court and dependent upon the controversial figure of Grigory Rasputin, was making decisions regarding military appointments that further alienated senior commanders and politicians. The war, which had been intended to unite Russian society, was instead becoming a source of profound division and disillusionment. The offensive officially ended on August 10, 1916, though the fighting continued in various forms for weeks afterward. By this date, it was clear that the operation had achieved neither the complete breakthrough that Brusilov had hoped for, nor the destruction of Austro-Hungarian military capacity that might have justified the extraordinary casualties. Instead, the offensive had resulted in approximately 500,000 to 1 million Russian casualties, killed, wounded, captured, or missing, while inflicting comparable losses upon the Central Powers. The balance sheet, when carefully examined, showed that the Russians had gained territory and had inflicted significant damage upon the Austro-Hungarian army, yet at a cost that their empire could ill afford. The strategic situation that emerged from the Brusilov offensive was profoundly ambiguous. On one hand, the offensive had demonstrated that the Russian army, when properly led and supplied, was capable of mounting large-scale operations and achieving tactical success against even the Central Powers. Brusilov himself emerged from the offensive with enhanced reputation, at least among military professionals who understood the constraints under which he had operated. The offensive had also provided some relief to the Western Front, as German resources were diverted eastward to contain the Russian breakthrough. Yet on the other hand, the offensive had exposed the fundamental weaknesses that would ultimately lead to Russia's military collapse: the lack of adequate supply lines, the failure of the higher command to provide coordinated support, the mounting casualties that could not be replaced, and the deteriorating morale of the troops all pointed toward a military system approaching its breaking point. The Brusilov offensive, which was intended to be Russia's thunderclap of military power, instead became a harbinger of the catastrophe to come. The human dimension of the offensive's failure was perhaps most poignantly captured in the letters and diaries of soldiers who participated in it. One soldier, writing in August after weeks of fighting, expressed a sentiment that would become increasingly common in the Russian army. "We have won great victories this summer, yet I feel that we have lost something fundamental. The men no longer believe that this war can be won. They fight because they must, but the spirit that once animated the army has departed. I fear that even if we achieve great tactical successes in the future, they will not be enough to save Russia." The casualty figures themselves tell a story of extraordinary suffering. The estimated 500,000 to 1 million Russian casualties represented an enormous proportion of the army's total strength. When these losses are considered alongside the casualties suffered in previous years of the war, the cumulative effect becomes almost incomprehensible. The Russian Empire, with a population of approximately 170 million, had already lost millions of soldiers to death, wounds, and capture. The Brusilov offensive added to this staggering total at a rate that exceeded the capacity of the empire's demographic system to replace. The Austro-Hungarian losses, though equally catastrophic, had different implications. The Austro-Hungarian Empire, already fragile politically and economically, found its military capacity severely compromised by the losses inflicted during the Brusilov offensive. The empire's various nationalities and ethnic groups, which had been held together through imperial authority and military tradition, began to question whether continued sacrifice was justified. Desertions from the Austro-Hungarian army increased dramatically after the Brusilov offensive, and many soldiers of non-German ethnicity began to wonder whether their loyalty to the empire was reciprocated. The offensive's failure to achieve a decisive breakthrough also had profound implications for the broader conduct of the First World War. Germany, which had been pursuing a two-front war with increasing difficulty, found itself forced to commit additional resources to the Eastern Front precisely when the situation in France demanded maximum effort. The Somme offensive, which began in July 1916, was partly intended to relieve pressure on France by forcing Germany to commit resources away from the Western Front. Yet the Brusilov offensive, by threatening German interests in the East, complicated German strategic planning and forced difficult choices regarding resource allocation. By the time the Brusilov offensive concluded in August, it was clear that the war had entered a new and more desperate phase. The initial hopes that the offensive might achieve a breakthrough that would transform the strategic situation had proven illusory. Instead, the offensive had become another episode in the grinding, attritional warfare that characterized the First World War. The Russian army had demonstrated its capacity for tactical excellence and coordinated operations, yet these achievements had come at a cost that the empire could not sustain indefinitely. The crisis that the Brusilov offensive represented extended beyond the military sphere into the realm of politics, economics, and social stability. The empire's financial system was straining under the burden of war expenses. The agricultural system, disrupted by the conscription of millions of peasants, was failing to produce adequate supplies for both the army and the civilian population. The industrial system, while making efforts to increase military production, remained inadequate to the demands of modern warfare. All of these systemic weaknesses were exacerbated by the massive casualties and continued stalemate that the Brusilov Offensive exemplified. As August 1916 drew to a close, the Russian Empire stood at a genuine turning point. The military situation, while not yet catastrophic, was clearly unsustainable. The Brusilov Offensive had proven to be the Empire's last great military achievement, the final moment when Russian arms achieved a significant tactical victory. Yet this victory, instead of revitalizing the Empire's capacity to continue the war, had instead accelerated the internal processes of decay and dissolution that would ultimately lead to revolution and collapse. The thunderclap that Brusilov had unleashed would echo through Russian history, not as a symbol of renewed power, but as a monument to the empire's inability to sustain itself under the unprecedented strains of modern industrial warfare. The summer of 1916 stretched on with merciless heat across the Eastern Front. By the middle of July, the initial momentum of Brusilov's offensive had begun to fracture under the weight of its own ambitions and the stubborn resistance of German reinforcements, and what had begun as a thunderclap of tactical brilliance was becoming a grinding attrition that would consume the remaining strength of the Russian Empire. The offensive that had captured over 1 million prisoners and inflicted catastrophic losses on the Central Powers had achieved something no Russian general had managed in 2 years of war: tactical victory on a grand scale. Yet victory, in the mathematics of the First World War, was a currency of diminishing value. The Russian army had paid an estimated 500,000 to 1 million casualties to achieve these gains. The Austro-Hungarian forces had suffered equally devastating losses, with estimates suggesting over 1 million casualties when counting the dead, wounded, captured, and deserters. But while the Central Powers could draw upon German reserves and reorganize their shattered formations, Russia possessed no such luxury. By the 16th of June, mere 12 days after the initial assault, the German High Command had begun shifting reinforcements from the Western Front to stabilize the Eastern Theater. General Hindenburg understood what Brusilov's success represented. Not merely a military setback, but a symbol of Russian capability that could reignite the spirits of an increasingly demoralized army. The Germans moved with characteristic efficiency, diverting divisions that might have been committed to the grinding battles around Verdun. This strategic choice would have profound consequences, neither side fully anticipated at the time. General Alexei Brusilov himself, commanding from his headquarters in Mogilev, watched his offensive's character transform as July progressed. The initial breakthrough that had shattered Austro-Hungarian formations became increasingly difficult to exploit. Supply lines stretched across hundreds of kilometers of recaptured territory. Ammunition stocks, never abundant in the Russian army, began to dwindle as the offensive consumed ordnance at rates the imperial munitions factories could not sustain. The very success of the first weeks had created logistical nightmares that no amount of tactical brilliance could overcome. A letter written by Brusilov on the 23rd of July to the chief of the Imperial General Staff captured the mounting frustration. He wrote of the necessity to continue operations, of the strategic importance of maintaining pressure on the Central Powers, yet beneath these professional assessments lay a growing recognition that his army was approaching exhaustion. His soldiers, despite their remarkable initial success, were becoming increasingly depleted. The reinforcements promised from other fronts failed to materialize in adequate numbers. The Tsar's government, distracted by political turmoil in Petrograd and increasingly dominated by the influence of Rasputin and the Tsarina, seemed incapable of understanding the logistical demands of sustaining such a massive offensive. The soldiers themselves, those ordinary men who had achieved the extraordinary, began to experience the psychological and physical toll of continuous combat. A Russian infantryman's diary, discovered decades later in a Moscow archive, provides haunting testimony to their experience. Written by a junior officer named Mikhail Volkov in early August, the entry reads, "We have taken so much ground, captured so many enemies, yet we are exhausted beyond measure. The men sleep in their boots when they sleep at all. Dysentery spreads through the ranks. We have heard rumors that the Germans are bringing fresh divisions. How long can we continue? The victory feels hollow when we see the cost." By the end of July and into August, the offensive had effectively stalled. The German counterattacks, while not driving the Russians back to their starting positions, had succeeded in halting forward momentum. The front stabilized along new lines that represented a Russian advance of significant territorial extent, but at a cost that would prove unsustainable. On the 10th of August 1916, Brusilov made the decision to cease major offensive operations. The thunderclap had exhausted itself. The casualty figures painted a picture of Pyrrhic victory. Russian casualties, estimated between 500,000 and 1 million dead, wounded, or captured, represented an irreplaceable drain on manpower. The Austro-Hungarian army, shattered though it was, could at least draw upon the industrial capacity and manpower of Germany. Russia possessed no such advantage. Every soldier lost was a soldier not available for the future. Every piece of equipment destroyed represented months of difficult production. Yet the impact of the Brusilov offensive extended far beyond the immediate military balance. The offensive had demonstrated that the Russian army, given proper leadership, adequate ammunition supplies, and tactical surprise, could inflict devastating defeats upon its enemies. For a brief moment in 1916, the possibility of Russian military success seemed real. This had profound psychological effects across the Russian Empire. Workers in Petrograd heard reports of victories. Peasants in distant villages learned that Russian soldiers had prevailed. The morale boost was genuine and significant. In the broader context of the Great War, the Brusilov Offensive had diverted German resources from the Western Front. The Battle of the Somme, raging simultaneously in France, might have ended differently had Germany not been forced to commit reinforcements to the east. Some historians debate the extent to which this diversion affected Western Front operations, but the strategic consequence seems undeniable. Germany was forced to wage simultaneous major offensives on multiple fronts, a situation that favored the Entente despite the immediate tactical successes of the Central Powers. For Austria-Hungary, the consequences proved catastrophic. The Austro-Hungarian army, already suffering from internal ethnic tensions and logistical difficulties, emerged from the Brusilov offensive fundamentally weakened. The empire would never fully recover its offensive capacity. The offensive had accelerated the process by which Austria-Hungary became increasingly dependent upon German support and direction. The Austro-Hungarian General Staff would spend the remainder of the war fighting defensive battles and managing the internal disintegration of their multinational force. Yet, the true tragedy of the Brusilov offensive lay not in what it achieved militarily, but in what it could not prevent. The massive casualties, the exhaustion of resources, and the continued failures of the Russian government to address the fundamental problems of the imperial system created conditions for revolutionary ferment. The soldiers who had bled for the Brusilov offensive would, within months, begin to question whether their sacrifices had meaning or purpose. The workers in Petrograd who had celebrated the initial victories would, by the winter of 1916 and into 1917, grow increasingly desperate and radical in their political demands. Brusilov himself understood this danger. In his memoirs, written after the Russian Revolution had transformed his world, he reflected on the offensive with complicated emotions. He had achieved what he set out to do militarily. He had defeated the enemy in battle. Yet he recognized that military victory in a war where the home front was collapsing held limited meaning. He wrote of his growing frustration with the incompetence of the imperial government, its inability to sustain the war effort, its refusal to implement the necessary reforms that might have preserved the monarchy. The months following the offensive saw the Russian army continue to deteriorate despite its tactical successes. The reinforcements promised never arrived in sufficient numbers. The ammunition supplies continued to dwindle. Discipline, always fragile in the Russian conscript army, began to break down more visibly. By the autumn of 1916, Russian soldiers were beginning to desert in increasing numbers. They were not fleeing because they had been defeated, but because they questioned the purpose of their suffering. The initial enthusiasm generated by the Brusilov offensive had given way to a deeper despair. The political consequences unfolded with tragic inevitability. The Tsar, isolated in his headquarters at Mogilev and increasingly dominated by the Tsarina and her circle, became convinced that only military victory could save his throne. He began to involve himself more directly in military operations, a development that horrified professional officers like Brusilov. The Tsar's interventions, based more on wishful thinking than strategic reality, further undermined the coordination of the war effort. The Russian government, meanwhile, continued to demonstrate its utter inability to manage the home front. Food shortages worsened, inflation spiraled out of control. The industrial workers of Petrograd and Moscow grew increasingly desperate and angry. General Brusilov watched these developments with growing alarm. He understood that military victories, however impressive, could not save an empire that was rotting from within. In his correspondence with other senior officers, he expressed his concerns about the political situation, yet he was powerless to prevent the catastrophe that was unfolding. The Brusilov offensive had been the last great military achievement of Imperial Russia, but it had also hastened the empire's final collapse. The winter of 1916 into 1917 proved decisive. The Russian army, exhausted from the Brusilov offensive and subsequent operations, began to fragment. Discipline collapsed in many units. Desertion became endemic. Mutinies occurred with increasing frequency. The soldiers, having sacrificed so much and achieved so little in terms of any visible progress toward peace, became increasingly receptive to radical political ideas. Bolshevik agitators moved through the army, distributing propaganda that resonated with the soldiers' despair and anger. By February of 1917, the final collapse came. The February Revolution, beginning with strikes and demonstrations in Petrograd, quickly escalated into the overthrow of the Tsarist regime. The military, asked to suppress the revolution, refused. Soldiers went over to the revolutionaries. The imperial government, having lost the support of both the army and the urban population, simply ceased to exist. The Tsar abdicated, and the old world of Imperial Russia passed into history. Brusilov himself was caught in these revolutionary currents. Having served the old regime faithfully, he faced an uncertain future under the new government. The Bolsheviks, upon seizing power in October 1917, faced the question of what to do with the old imperial officers. Brusilov, recognizing the existential threat that Germany posed to the Russian people regardless of political system, eventually agreed to serve the Red Army. He would command Soviet forces and contribute to the victory over the Central Powers and the subsequent Russian Civil War. Yet he never regained the prominence or influence he had possessed before the revolution. The Brusilov Offensive thus stands as a paradox in military history. It was a triumph of tactical brilliance and operational planning. It demonstrated the capacity of the Russian army, when properly led and adequately supplied, to defeat its enemies decisively. The casualties inflicted upon the Central Powers, estimated at over 1.5 million, represented an enormous drain on resources that neither Austria-Hungary nor Germany could easily replace. The territorial gains, while not decisive in themselves, represented a significant shift in the military balance, yet the offensive ultimately failed in its strategic purpose. It did not knock Austria-Hungary out of the war. It did not force a German withdrawal from Eastern Europe. It did not create conditions for a negotiated peace. Instead, it accelerated the internal collapse of the Russian Empire by consuming the last reserves of manpower and material that might have sustained the imperial system. The soldiers who achieved victory on the battlefield became the revolutionaries who overthrew the Tsar. The legacy of the Brusilov Offensive is thus one of tragic irony. It was Russia's last great military victory before the collapse of the empire that had launched it. The soldiers who fought in it had achieved something remarkable. They had defeated an enemy that had seemed invincible just months before. Yet their sacrifice could not prevent the catastrophe that was approaching. The fundamental problems of the Russian state, its political corruption, its economic dysfunction, its inability to sustain a modern war, could not be solved by military victories, however impressive. In the decades following the revolution and the establishment of the Soviet Union, Soviet historians elevated the Brusilov Offensive to a central place in their narratives of the Great War. They saw in it evidence of Russian military capability and courage. They emphasized the victory and minimized the catastrophic casualties. The Bolsheviks, having used the military collapse to seize power, had little interest in emphasizing how their revolution had been enabled by military failure. Western historians, meanwhile, often overlooked the Brusilov Offensive in their focus on the Western Front. The battles of Verdun and the Somme dominated their narratives. The Eastern Front seemed secondary, a theater where the real decisions of the war were not made. Yet the Brusilov Offensive deserves recognition as one of the most significant military operations of the entire conflict. Its scale, its impact on the Central Powers, and its consequences for the Russian Empire make it central to understanding both the First World War and the Russian Revolution. The soldiers who fought in the Brusilov Offensive, the Russian infantrymen who charged across no man's land, the officers who coordinated the assault, the engineers who built the roads to move supplies, these men achieved something extraordinary. They defeated enemies that had seemed unbeatable. They captured hundreds of thousands of prisoners. They inflicted devastating casualties on the Central Powers. Yet within a year, many of these same men would be fighting in the Russian Civil War, and many would not survive to see the Soviet Union they had helped bring into being. The Brusilov Offensive stands as a monument to both the possibility and the limits of military power. It demonstrates that brilliant leadership, careful planning, and disciplined execution can achieve remarkable victories. Yet it also shows that military victories, however impressive, cannot compensate for fundamental failures of political leadership and state capacity. The Russian Empire, for all the bravery of its soldiers and the tactical genius of its commanders, was simply too dysfunctional to sustain a modern industrial war. The Brusilov Offensive was not the cause of Russia's collapse, but it was the last moment when the old empire seemed capable of victory. After the summer of 1916, the future belonged to revolution and to the new world that would emerge from the ashes of the old. Thank you so much for watching. I really appreciate you taking the time to explore these incredible World War I stories with me today. If you enjoyed this video, Please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. It genuinely helps us reach more history enthusiasts like you. I'd love to hear what you think. Drop a comment below and let me know which part of this story resonated with you most. Your thoughts really matter to us. And don't worry, there are plenty more fascinating World War I stories coming your way. We've got some amazing content lined up that I think you're going to love. So stay curious and keep learning. History is waiting for you. See you next time.